Chapter 5. "What about the mice, Daddy?" Patty asked impatiently. "What happened to the mice?" Mark decided it might be okay now, and he drew the attention of his children to the Jaunt attendants, who were passing gas out only 3 aisles from them. Rick only nodded, but Patty looked troubled as a lady with a fashionably shaved and painted head took a whiff from the rubber mask and fell unconscious. "Can't jaunt when you're awake, can you, Dad?" Ricky said. Mark nodded and smiled reassuringly at Patricia. Karoon understood even before the government got into it, he said. "How did the government get into it, Mark?" Marilys asked. Mark smiled. "Computer time," he said. "The database. That was the only thing that Karoon couldn't beg, borrow, or steal. The computer handled the actual particulate transmission. Billions of pieces of information. It's still the computer, you know. But make sure you don't come through with your head somewhere in the middle of your stomach." Marilys shuddered. "Don't be frightened," he said. "There's never been a screw-up like that, Mare. Never." "There's always a first time," she muttered. Mark looked at Ricky. "How did he know?" he asked his son. "How did Karoon know you had to be asleep, Rick?" "When he put the mice in backwards," Rick said slowly, "they were all right, at least as long as he didn't put them all in. They were only, well, messed up when he put them in headfirst, right?" "Right," Mark said. The Jaunt attendants were moving in now, wheeling their silent cart of oblivion. He wasn't going to have time to finish after all. Perhaps it was just as well. It didn't take many experiments to clarify what was happening, of course. The Jaunt killed the entire trucking business, kids, but at least it took the pressure off the experimenters. Yes, foot dragging had become a luxury again. The tests had gone on for better than 20 years. Although Karoon's first tests with drugged mice had convinced him that unconscious animals were not subject to what was known forever after as the organic effect, or more simply the Jaunt effect. He and Moscone had drugged several mice, put them through Portal 1, retrieved them at the other side, and had waited anxiously for the test subjects to reawaken, or to die. They had reawakened, and after a brief recovery period, they had taken up their mouse lives, eating, fucking, playing, and shitting, with no ill effects whatsoever. Those mice became the first of several generations, which was studied with great interest. They showed no long-term ill effects. They did not die sooner. Their pups were not born with 2 heads or green fur, and neither did these pups show any other long-term effects. "When did they start with people, Dad?" Rick asked, although he had certainly read this in school. "Tell the part." "I want to know what happened to the mice," Patty said again. Although the Jaunt attendants had now reached the head of their aisle, they themselves were near the foot, Mark Otez paused for a moment to reflect. His daughter, who knew less, had nevertheless listened to her heart and asked the right question. Therefore, it was his son's question he chose to answer. The first human jaunters had not been astronauts or test pilots. They were convict volunteers who had not even been screened with any particular interest in their psychological ability. In fact, it was the view of the scientists now in charge, Karoon was not one of them, he had become what is commonly called a titular head, that the freakier they were, the better if a mental spaz could go through and come out all right, or at least no worse than he or she had been going in. Then the process was probably safe for the executives, politicians, and fashion models of the world. Half a dozen of these volunteers were brought to Province, Vermont, a site which had since become every bit as famous as Kitty Hawk, North Carolina, had once been. Gassed and fed through the portal, exactly 2 hand miles apart, one by one. Mark told his children this because, of course, all 6 of the volunteers came back just fine and feeling perky, thank you. He did not tell them about the purported 7th volunteer. This figure, who might have been real or a myth, or most probably a combination of the two, even had a name: Rudy Foggia. Foggia was supposed to have been a convicted murderer, sentenced to death in the state of Florida for the murders of 4 old people at a Sarasota bridge party. According to the Apocrypha, the combined forces of the Central Intelligence Agency and the FBI had come to Foggia with a unique one-time take-it-or-leave-it, absolutely not to be repeated offer. Take the jaunt wide awake. Come through okay, and we put your pardon, signed by Governor Thurgood, in your hand. Out you walk, free to follow the one true cross, or to off a few more old folks, playing bridge in their yellow pants and white shoes. Come through dead or insane, tough titty, as the kitty was purported to have said. What do you say? Foggia, who understood that Florida was one state that really meant business about the death penalty, and whose lawyer had told him that he was in all probability next to ride Old Sparky, said okay. Enough scientists to fill a jury box, with 4 or 5 left over as alternatives, were presented on the great day in the summer of 2007. But if the Foggia story was true, and Mark Ortez believed it probably was, he doubted if it had been any of the scientists who talked. More likely it had been one of the guards who had flown with Foggia from Rayford to Montpelier, and then escorted him from Montpelier to Provence in an armored truck. If I come through this alive, Foggia reported to have said, I want a chicken dinner before I blow this joint. And then he stepped through Portal 1 and reappeared at Portal 2 immediately. He came through alive, but Rudy Foggia was in no condition to eat his chicken dinner. In the space it took the jaunt across the 2 miles, pegged at 0.00000067 of a second by computer, Foggia's hair had turned snow white. His face had not changed in any physical way. It was not lined or jowly or wasted, but it gave the impression of great, almost incredible age. Foggia shuffled out of the portal, his eyes bulging blankly, his mouth twitching, his hands splayed out in front of him. Presently, he began to drool. The scientists who had gathered around drew away from him, and no, Mark really doubted if any of them had talked. They knew about the rats, after all, and the guinea pigs, and the hamsters, any animal, in fact, with more brains than your average flatworm. It must have felt a bit like those German scientists who tried to impregnate Jewish women with the sperm of German shepherds. What happened? One of the scientists shouted. He is reputed to have shouted. It was the only question Foggia had a chance to answer. It's eternity in there, he said, and dropped dead of what was diagnosed as a massive heart attack. The scientists foregathered there were left with his corpse, which was neatly taken care of by the CIA and the FBI, and that strange and awful dying declaration. It's eternity in there. Daddy, I want to know what happened to the mice, Patty repeated. The only reason she had a chance to ask again was because the man in the expensive suit and the Eternashine shoes had developed into something of a problem for the jaunt attendants. He didn't really want to take the gas, and was disguising it with a lot of bluff, bully boy talk. The attendants were doing their job as well as they could, smiling, cajoling, persuading, but it had slowed them down. Mark sighed. He had opened the subject only as a way of distracting his children from the pre-jaunt festivities. It was true, but he had opened it now, and he supposed he could have closed it truthfully as he could without alarming them or upsetting them. He would not tell them, for instance, about C.K. Summers' book, The Politics of the Jaunt, which contained one section called The Jaunt Under the Rose, a compendium of the more believable rumors about the jaunt, the story of Rudy Foggia. He of the Bridge Club murders and the uneaten chicken dinner was in there. There were also case histories of some other 30 or more or less, or who knows, volunteers, scapegoats, or madmen who had jaunted wide awake over the last 300 years. Most of them arrived at the other end dead. The rest were hopelessly insane. In some cases, the act of re-emerging had actually seemed to shock them to death. Summer's section of jaunt rumors and apocrypha contained other unsettling intelligence as well. that Jaunt had apparently been used several times as a murder weapon. In the most famous and only documented case, which had occurred a mere 30 years ago, a Jaunt researcher named Lester Mickelson had tied up his wife with their daughter's plexiglass dream ropes and pushed her screaming through the Jaunt portal at Silver City, Nevada. But before doing it, Mickelson had pushed the nil button on his Jaunt board, erasing each and every one of the hundreds of thousands of possible portals through which Mrs. Mickelson might have emerged. Anywhere from neighboring Reno to the experimental Jaunt station on Io, one of the Jovian moons. So there was Mrs. Mickelson jaunting forever somewhere out there in the ozone. Mickelson's lawyer, after Mickelson had been held sane and able to stand trial for what he had done with the narrow limits of the law, perhaps he was sane, but in any practical sense, Lester Mickelson was just as mad as a hatter. Had ciphered a novel defense. His client could not be tried for murder because no one could prove conclusively that Mrs. Mickelson was dead. This had raised the terrible specter of the woman, discorporeal but somehow still sentient, screaming into limbo forever. Mickelson was convicted and executed. In addition, Summers suggested the Jaunt had been used by various tin pot dictators to get rid of political dissidents and political adversaries. Some thought that the Mafia had their own illegal Jaunt stations tied into the central Jaunt computer through their CIA connections. It was suggested that the Mafia used the Jaunt's nil capability to get rid of bodies which, unlike that of the unfortunate Mrs. Mickelson, were already dead. Seen in that light, the Jaunt became the ultimate Jimmy Hoffa machine, ever so much better than the local gravel pit or quarry. All of this had led to Summers' conclusion and theories about the Jaunt, and that, of course, led back to Patty's persistent question about the mice. "Well," Mark said slowly. His wife signaled with her eyes for him to be careful. "Even now, no one really knows, Patty. But all the experiments with animals, including the mice, seem to lead to the conclusion that while the Jaunt is almost instantaneous physically, it takes a long, long time mentally." "I don't get it," Patty said glumly. "I knew I wouldn't." But Ricky was looking at his father thoughtfully. "They went on thinking," he said. "The test animals, and so would we, if we didn't get knocked out." "Yes," Mark said. "That's what we believe now." Something was dawning in Ricky's eyes. Fright, excitement. "It isn't just teleportation, is it, Dad? It's some kind of time warp. It's eternity in there," Mark thought. "In a way," he said. "But that's a comic book phrase. It sounded good, but it doesn't really mean anything. It seems to revolve around the idea of consciousness and the fact that consciousness doesn't particulate. It remains whole and constant. It also retains some screwy sense of time. But we don't know how pure consciousness would measure time, or even if that concept has any meaning to pure mind. We can't even conceive what pure mind might be." Mark fell silent, troubled by his son's eyes, which were suddenly so sharp and curious. He understands, but he doesn't understand, Mark thought. Your mind can be your best friend. It can keep you amused even when there's nothing to read, nothing to do. But it can turn on you when it's left with no input for too long. It can turn on you, which means that it turns on itself. Savages itself, perhaps consumes itself in an unthinkable act of auto-cannibalism. How long there, in terms of years? 0.00000000067 seconds for the body to jaunt. But how long for the unparticulated consciousness? 100 years, 1,000, 1,000,000, 1,000,000,000. How long alone with your thoughts in an endless field of white? And then, when 1,000,000,000 eternities have passed, the crashing return of light and form and body. Who wouldn't go insane? "Ricky," he began, but the Jaunt attendants had arrived with their cart. "Are you ready?" one asked. Mark nodded. "Daddy, I'm scared," Patty said in a thin voice. Will it hurt? No, honey, of course it won't hurt, Mark said, and his voice was calm enough, but his heart was beating a little fast. It always did, although this would be something like his 25th jaunt. I'll go first, and you'll see how easy it is. The jaunt attendant looked at him questioningly. Mark nodded and made a smile. The mask descended. Mark took it in his own hands and breathed deep of the dark. The first thing he became aware of was the hard black Martian sky as seen through the top of the dome which surrounded Whitehead City. It was night here, and the stars sprawled with a fiery brilliance undreamed of on Earth. The second thing he became aware of was some sort of disturbance in the recovery room. Mutters, then shouts, then a shrill scream. Oh dear God, that's Marilys! He thought and struggled up from his jaunt couch, fighting the waves of dizziness. There was another scream, and he saw jaunt attendants running toward their couches, their bright red jumpers flying around their knees. Marilys staggered toward him, pointing. She screamed again and then collapsed on the floor, sending an unoccupied jaunt couch rolling slowly down the aisle with one weakly clutching hand. But Mark had already followed the direction of her pointing finger. He had seen. It hadn't been fright in Ricky's eyes, it had been excitement. He should have known, because he knew Ricky, who had fallen out of the highest crotch of the tree in their backyard, Schenectady, when he was only 7, who had broken his arm and was lucky that had all he had broken. Ricky, who had dared to go faster and further on his slideboard than any other kids in the neighborhood. Ricky, who was first to take any dare. Ricky and fear were not well acquainted. Until now, beside Ricky, his sister still mercifully slept. The thing that had been his son bounced and writhed on its jaunt couch, a 12-year-old boy with snow-white fall of hair and eyes which were incredibly ancient, the corneas gone a sickly yellow. Here was a creature older than time masquerading as a boy, and yet it bounced and writhed with a kind of horrid, obscene glee, and at its choked, lunatic cackles the jaunt attendants drew back in terror. Some of them fled, although they had been trained to cope with just such an unthinkable eventuality. The old young legs twitched and quivered, claw hands beat and twisted and danced on the air. Abruptly they descended, and the thing that had been his son began to claw at its face. "Longer than you think, Dad," it cackled. "Longer than you think. Held my breath when they gave me the gas. Wanted to see. I saw. Longer than you think." Cackling and screeching, the thing on the jaunt couch suddenly clawed its own eyes out. Blood gouted. The recovery room was an aviary of screaming voices now. "Longer than you think, Dad. I saw. Long jaunt. Longer than you think." It said other things before the jaunt attendants were finally able to bear it away, rolling its couch swiftly away as it screamed and clawed at the eyes that had seen unseeable forever and ever. It said other things, and then it began to scream. But Mark Otez didn't hear it, because by then